Hey everyone, my name is Jonathan and I'm a volunteer mentor with Forma Futures. I'm currently a senior associate at a large cap PE firm focused on late stage software buyouts. And prior to that, I worked in financial institutions investment banking. I'm joined by my colleague Sam, and I'll turn it over to him to introduce himself.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's session. My name is Sam. I'm also a senior associate at a large cap private equity firm where I primarily spend my time focused on buyout and growth investing, primarily across the technology and services sector.
So today we're going to be talking about the Paper LBO. And to start, what is a Paper LBO? It's one of the most popular assessments that PE firms use to test whether a candidate understands the concepts of an LBO and also test their technical skills. These tests are usually administered with a pen and paper, no calculators allowed. So it's a great way for PE firms to assess whether you can think on your feet. Now, the reason why PE firms like to use paper LBOs is because it usually only takes 15 minutes to administer, and it's a great way to screen candidates before doing more time-intensive interviews like a model test, which we'll cover in a future video. Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, totally agree with that, Jonathan. And look, I think while you're likely to find the paper LBO exercise in nearly all private equity interview processes, the actual complexity and the context can change. And so personally, I've had interviews where a paper LBO was just a single component of a broader kind of verbal case study with things like market sizing and other qualitative questions aimed at getting to your kind of strategic judgment and evaluation of industries. And other interviews where the interview actually just jumps directly into the quantitative portion. In all cases, the thing to remember is that the goal of a paper LBO is to ultimately test a candidate's understanding of the underlying mechanics of a leveraged buyout and not just your mental math skills.
Now, Sam and I prepared this lesson to help you prepare for the paper LBO. We're going to start by covering LBO concepts, and then we're going to cover the five-step checklist for completing a paper LBO. And afterwards, we're going to apply these concepts by doing a mock interview. Now, Sam's going to walk us through LBO concepts.
Awesome. So let's zoom out for a minute and just kind of set the scene. An LBO stands for a leveraged buyout, which is effectively just a type of transaction where a buyer uses debt or leverage to partially finance an acquisition of a target company. And so this is a transaction structure that's most commonly used by private equity sponsors to quote unquote magnify returns. But this is very conceptually, very similar to buying a house with a mortgage. Now, we'll walk through a more concrete example of this later, but effectively by raising debt capital in the form of loans or bonds, the sponsor is able to buy the company with a lower upfront equity check, which ultimately enhances the returns at exit if the private equity firm can actually create value. So now this is a great segue into how investors actually drive value creation and returns in an LBO context. Now, the key driver of returns can ultimately be bifurcated between both financial levers and operational levers. On the operational side, the goal in every deal is to ultimately grow the company, increase profitability so you can generate more cash flow during your hold period, and ultimately exit on a larger EBITDA base. Now, this can be accomplished through both organic means, so like launching new products, expanding into new geographies, or implementing cost controls to increase margins, and by inorganic growth. And so that includes things like strategic add-on acquisitions, which can be used to increase scale and add complementary business lines. Now, we know a key tenet of the LBO is the use of debt financing. And so as you generate cash during your hold period, you can use that cash to pay down the debt, thus reducing your interest expense and increasing the sponsor's equity at exit. Now, the final portion of kind of the drivers of returns in LBOs is multiple expansion. Now, normally as PE investors, we assume some degree of multiple contraction in our models. But if you're able to build a better business, for example, by increasing the profitability and scale of a company, buyers may reward you with a re-rated multiple in excess of what you initially purchased the business for at entry. And so more frequently in private equity, you're going to be assuming multiple contraction at exit. Now, that's not just for conservatism, but also because, as growth tends to slow as firms scale and capture more market share. So the incremental growth potential is lower when you actually go to exit. I'll turn this back to Jonathan now to talk through some key things to keep in mind as you approach the actual paper LBO.
Thanks, Sam. So that covers paper LBO concepts. We're going to move on to the paper LBO mental checklist. Now, when you go through paper LBOs, you have to remember that you're going to be in an interview setting. You might have a lot going on and a lot of things on your mind, but it's really helpful to have a simple checklist to help guide you through the paper LBO. and also help you remember to gather all the necessary information and facts to complete that LBO. Half the battle with paper LBOs is asking your interviewer for all of the information because oftentimes your interviewer will only give you a subset of instructions and information. And it'll be up to you, the interviewee, to gather all of the information that you need in order to complete the LBO. And so with that, a paper LBO can be boiled into 5 simple steps. Number 1, gather your entry assumptions, things like your purchase entry multiple, your entry and exit date, sources and uses, initial leverage, and interest expense, as well as your initial equity check. The second thing that you want to gather is the financial profile or build out a financial forecast. Things like revenue growth, EBITDA margin expansion over the next 5 years. You want to be able to project out revenue and EBITDA until your exit. The third thing that you want to look out for is your cash flow walk assumptions. These are the things that are going to get you from net income to levered free cash flow on the cash flow statement. The fourth thing is your exit assumptions. That's including your exit multiple and how much debt you have at exit. One very helpful thing to do when you're doing these paper LBOs is to assume no debt paydown during the hold period to simplify your algebra. The fifth step is calculating returns. And a very helpful heuristic for translating MOICs to IRRs is outlined on this page. A 2x MOIC is a 15% IRR. A 2.5x MOIC is a 20% IRR. Memorizing these little heuristics and rules is really helpful and will basically cover about 90% of the paper LBOs that you'll encounter. And even if you run into an MOIC that's not exactly 2x or 2.5x, let's say it's 2.2x, you'll be able to estimate what the IRR is. It's going to be between 15 and 20%. In actuality, it's 17% IRR. So without further ado, let's dive into the paper LBO example.
Awesome. And so for the purposes of this section, I'm going to be playing the role of the interviewer, and Jonathan here has volunteered to be our interviewee. And so just to kick us off, Jonathan, we're buying a company for 10 times its 2024 EBITDA of $20 million. The company currently generates $100 million of revenue, and we believe we can grow this at 15% with constant margins over our 5-year hold period before exiting in 2029. We plan to finance this deal with 4 turns of debt at an annual interest rate of 10%. Now, Jonathan, what do you think about this deal?
Thanks, Sam. So Sam just read us the initial prompt. I want you to remember what we discussed earlier, that your interviewer will only give you a subset of the information that you need for the paper LBO. And so what we've done on this next page is we've highlighted the key relevant facts that we're going to use in our paper LBO. You can see that we have our entry multiple assumption, entry EBITDA. We also have the financial forecast, 100 of revenue growing 15% at constant margins. And we also know we're going to hold it for 5 years and exit in 2029. And we also have initial leverage assumptions. And so when we go back to our checklist, we see that we have 2 out of the 5 checklist items all pretty much covered. The only things that we need to ask Sam for are our cash flow walk assumptions. That's the D&A, CapEx, cap software, net working capital, and tax rate, and also our exit assumptions. So Sam, do you mind providing us with the D&A, CapEx, cap software, net working capital, and tax rate assumptions?
Yeah, no problem at all. And so starting with D&A, let's assume that we have $5 million of constant D&A through the forecast period. And similarly on the CapEx side, that's equal to D&A for simplicity. For working capital, we can assume that this grows by $5 million every year as the company grows, and we can assume it's 25% tax rate. On the exit multiple, let's assume parity with entry.
Perfect. Now that we have all the information we need for a paper LBO, now we're going to walk through in Excel what that paper LBO looks like, and we'll fill it out together. What we have here is a filled out paper LBO example. We're going to go through this step by step, but just wanted to give you a quick look at what the finished product will look like. So starting with step 1, remember that we first have to outline our entry assumptions. And importantly, we're going to have to outline what we're going to pay and also how we're going to pay for it. And so what you see here is our TEV walk, which will outline what we're going to pay for the company. We were told 20 million of EBITDA at a 10 times multiple. So that's a 200 million TEV entry. And we're also going to outline how we're going to pay for it. And that's what the sources and uses section is for. We have our initial purchase price of 200 million. For simplicity, we're going to assume no fees. And that's something good to call out to your interviewers so that you can show that you know you usually calculate fees in a normal LBO setting. And we're also going to use a mix of debt and equity, like Sam was mentioning earlier, to fund our transaction. Now, Sam told us that we're going to be using 4 times EBITDA, which translates to about $80 million of debt. And we're going to plug the rest of our transaction sources with equity. And so remember, sources always equal uses in an LBO setting, and the plug between debt and total sources is going to be your equity check. What we've outlined here as well is the LTV, or loan to value. This is a common term in leverage transactions. Typically, your lenders will ask you to finance a transaction with more equity than debt. And so what you have here is the debt as a percentage of purchase price is only 40%. So that takes care of step one. We're going to move on to step two, which outlines our financial profile or financial forecast. Now, remember that Sam told us we have a company that's growing at 15% per annum. So I'm going to outline that. And we have constant margins. Remember, we had 100 million of revenue, 20 million of EBITDA. That's about 20% margins. So we're going to outline that here. Now, it's really good as you're filling this out, especially when you're doing it on pen and paper, to sound out your assumptions and tell your interviewer how you're thinking about the financial profile and the financial forecast. And as you can see here, for simplicity, we've assumed a constant 15% growth rate. But oftentimes, especially as companies grow larger and you encounter a lot of large numbers, that growth rate usually slows down. And additionally, a lot of times when PE firms buy companies, they'll look to optimize expenses. And so usually you would see some type of margin expansion over the hold period. For simplicity, we're not assuming those things. We're assuming a constant growth rate and constant EBITDA margin. But it's good to sort of call out those assumptions to your interviewer so you can show that you understand how a normal LBO works. So that takes care of step two. We've built out our financial forecast. Now we get to move on to the fun part, which is the cash flow walk. Now, you'll recall that Sam gave us all the components we need for our cash flow walk. He gave us our DNA, our CapEx cap software, change in net working capital, interest, and taxes. And so all we need to do now is just fill that out. And one thing as I'm filling it out, I just want you to remember that when you're doing this on pen and paper, it's totally fine to round numbers for your interview. Remember, the purpose of this interview is not to test your algebra, it's to test your understanding of LBO concepts and how to walk from EBITDA to free cash flow. And so Sam told us that DNA was 5 million per annum, so I'm going to fill that out here. He also told us that our interest expense is 10%. And so I'm going to fill that out here. It's calculated as 10% of debt. And because we're assuming no debt paydown over the hold period, it's just going to be a flat 8 million every single year. The next thing that we're going to fill out is our tax rate. And so Sam told us we have a 25% tax rate and that CapEx is equal to DNA, or CapEx and cap software is equal to DNA. So I'm going to fill that out here. And Sam also told us that net working capital increases every year by 5 million per annum. Really important to remember, and this is sometimes an issue where interviewees might make a mistake here. Change in net working capital, when it increases, it's a use of capital, so it's going to be a negative line item. And so we've now bridged to levered free cash flow over the 5-year hold period. And you can imagine when you're filling this out on a pen and paper, this would probably take a long time. This would be the most time-consuming part of your LBO, paper LBO test. But I want to show you a trick that might help you shave off a few minutes off your test. When you look at our financial profile, it's pretty steady. You're growing at a constant growth rate, margins are growing, are held constant over the hold period, and all of our cash flow walk line items are constant as well, which means you can use this free cash flow average trick, where you take the year 1 cash flow, the year 5 cash flow, take the average, and then multiply it by 5 years to get the total cash flow generated over the hold period. And so that's what I've done here. You can see that the estimate for calculating free cash flow over the 5-year hold period is 45. And in reality, the free cash flow generated is 43. And so you can use this step to just use, if you calculate year 1 and year 5 cash flow, you'll be able to take the average and multiply by 5.
Yep, and Jonathan, just really quickly to jump in, and if you don't use that trick and you're kind of stuck in that interview and you're going through all the arithmetic, just remember to kind of narrate your assumptions. Always talk through your thought processes, and when you're doing the mental math, it's completely fine to say, hey, for simplifying assumptions, I'm going to round this to the nearest whole number here. I think it's just very important that you avoid that kind of dead, awkward silence in that interview context, and you always just talk through what you're doing.
Thanks, Sam. Completely agree. So now that we calculated all of our levered free cash flow over the 5-year hold period, we can move on to step 4, which is calculating our exit proceeds. Now, you recall that companies are typically bought and sold off of EBITDA multiples. And so we were told that we wanted to assume an exit EBITDA multiple that's equal to our entry EBITDA multiple. So I'm going to put 10 times right here. Our exit EBITDA is 40 million, which means that our exit TEV at a 10 times multiple is just about $400 million. Now, we don't receive all of this $400 million. We only receive a portion of it because remember, we borrowed capital at entry to pay for this transaction. So we have to pay back our lenders. Now, we assume no debt pay down over the hold period, so we're going to just deduct the initial $80 million that we borrowed, but we're going to use the cash flow that we built over the 5-year hold period to pay for that debt. And so what you've seen here is the 43 or the $42.6 million of cash that we generated being applied to this debt balance of 80. When you incorporate those two things and deduct that from TEV, you end up with an exit equity value about 365. Now, an important caveat here and thing to note, and this is helpful to mention to your interviewer because it shows how you understand how LBOs work in reality, is that we're assuming no management options at exit. And so importantly, management options, without getting into too much detail, is basically a way for firms to incentivize their management team to create value over a hold period. And management basically gets paid out a percentage of the gain on sale at exit. And so typically in an LBO setting or when you're doing a real operating model, you're going to be deducting management options from your exit equity to calculate your sponsor proceeds. But for the sake of this paper LBO and for the sake of simplicity, we're assuming no management options here. So we have exit equity of about 365 or 364.8. Now we have to calculate our MOIC and our IRR, which takes us to step 5. And so you see up here, we have our return section, which is linked to the bottom down here. We're going to fill out our MOIC, and that's simply calculated by taking your exit equity divided by your initial equity. And then we're going to calculate your IRR. And the simple or the algebraic way of calculating it is by taking your MOIC, raising it to the 1/5 or the number of years that you have the hold period for, minus 1. And that gives you roughly a 25% IRR. Now, in a paper LBO setting, you're not going to have an Excel or calculator to raise things to different powers. And so remember the very helpful heuristic here. A 2x MOIC is a 15% IRR, a 2.5 is a 20% IRR. A 3x, which is what we have here, is roughly a 25% IRR. And that applies here as well. So that wraps up the return calculation section of the paper LBO. Now at the end of the interview, you'll be given an opportunity to summarize your takeaways. I would say that this is a really great opportunity for you to differentiate yourself as a candidate. The paper LBO in of itself and doing the math is relatively mechanical, but one way for you to differentiate yourself as an interviewee is to, one, show your investment judgment, but also tell your interviewer where you may want to test the need to believe assumptions of the given model. And so one way to put it would be, given this is an attractive return profile, 25% IRR and a 3x MOIC, at initial glance, it seems like an interesting company, a market-leading software company with high barriers to entry. But a few things that I want to diligence are things like the sustainability of growth, whether or not we can hold that 15% growth rate for the 5 years. Other things like TAM-SAM penetration, test market leadership by testing the NPS score and benchmarking versus peers, and looking at things like revenue retention and renewal rates, whether or not we can grow margins beyond 20%, and double-clicking on the CapEx cap software needs. All of these things are really important things to raise in actual diligence, as well as like looking at M&A opportunities. And so being able to mention these things, these keywords, these tidbits to your interviewer really helps you differentiate yourself as a candidate. Sam,
Awesome.
anything else you want to add to that?
I think that was perfect, Jonathan. So now this should conclude our Paper LBO walkthrough session. As a reminder, all of these materials will be available on the Forma Futures website, both the PowerPoint as well as the example Paper LBO Excel. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us or any of the other mentors listed on the PFF team page. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, guys.